The sound of my own voice delivering the valedictorian speech was a clear, vibrating lie. For 2 years, I had quietly been the financial backbone for a family who saw me only as an ATM with an MBA. My name is Donna Moore, and I watched stunned as 5 minutes into my biggest moment, my husband, my sister, and my parents stood up and walked out, heading straight for a brunch they deemed more important than my life's triumph. The betrayal was public, coordinated, and brutal. But they didn't know the house they left behind was paid for with a fortune they couldn't possibly imagine, or that I had spent the last 6 months meticulously mapping their destruction. The real question wasn't why they left, but what I had waiting for them when I returned. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in the house was thick with the scent of expensive fake prosperity, a blend of Scarlett's imported candles, and the faint, sweet decay of lies. I, Donna Moore, sat at the kitchen island, a pristine white fortress that matched the rest of the family home I secretly paid for. My mother, Vivian Moore, swept in her face, a mask of anxious elegance fussing over the organic, locally sourced produce I'd paid for that morning. The house was in the kind of desirable suburb where appearances were currency, and Vivian was its meticulous, terrifying banker. Everything had to look perfect, because to her looking perfect was being perfect. My father, Stephen Moore, shuffled past, pausing only to loudly complain about some minor local tax increase, his voice a perpetual low-level rumble of impotent frustration. He was a man of large opinions and zero actionable power, entirely dependent on my presumed modest consultant's salary. My husband, Julian Vance, finally drifted down around 10, wearing the same air of superior weariness he'd cultivated since he quit his job at the small design firm years ago. His studio, a converted guest room full of expensive, untouched canvases and high-end equipment I'd funded, was his sanctuary and his excuse. He was an artist, perpetually on the verge of his masterpiece, a dream he leveraged to justify his complete lack of income or contribution. He kissed my cheek, a practiced dry gesture, and poured himself the artisanal coffee I purchased. "The light wasn't right today," he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly messy hair. But I did have a fascinating chat with a potential patron. They were very taken with the concept of my break from commercialism. I nodded, already calculating the cost of the imported oil paints Julian would inevitably buy to soothe his non-existent creative block. That was the core of my life, calculating the cost of their pretension. They believed I was a highly paid but still human consultant, grinding away to support their upper-middle-class lifestyle. They didn't know that I was the majority shareholder and former CEO of Cyphertech, an IT firm whose recent acquisition had turned my initial investment into a fortune several times larger than what my father or Julian could earn in a lifetime. I had completed my MBA only as a personal punishing goal, a distraction from the loneliness of living a lie. My co-founder and only confidant, Leo Mendez, was the only soul who knew the scale of the secret empire I commanded. The true source of the house's perpetual financial drain, however, was my younger sister, Scarlett Moore. She didn't work. Her full-time occupation was maintaining her social cachet, which revolved entirely around her spectacular weekly Sunday brunch. It was an elaborate catered affair of expensive champagne, high-end appetizers, and forced exclusivity. "It's networking, Donna," she'd often condescend. "Something you wouldn't understand with your head stuck in spreadsheets." In reality, the entire event was a line item on my household budget, cleverly disguised under groceries and entertainment expenses. I was finishing up revisions on my valedictorian speech, the culmination of 2 years of sacrificing sleep and sanity, when I heard their voices drift from the living room. Vivian's voice was hushed but tight with predatory excitement. "We need to reallocate that next quarterly contribution, Scarlett. Your new SUV is essential for keeping up appearances. It's a reflection of Donna's success, really. We can use the funds she was going to use for the retirement account. She's young. She can easily catch up later." I froze. My own mother, with the full silent complicity of my father and the greedy participation of my sister, was not just spending my money, she was planning my financial future without my consent. It wasn't about need, it was about entitlement and control. The blood drained from my face, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. There was no longer any room for denial. This was a hostile takeover, not a family. I walked back to my study, the expensive hardwood floor feeling cold beneath my feet. I pulled up my laptop and stared at the final confirmed date. Graduation was next Saturday. I had 2 weeks. The truth hit me, not as a scream of rage, but as a silent, icy command. The facade must come down, and I would be the one to light the match. I typed my password and opened an encrypted file hidden deep within my system, a contingency plan I designed years ago, almost as a joke. The title was no longer funny. It read, Operation Zero Tolerance. The stage was set, the audience was waiting. The performance was about to begin. The trigger had been pulled, but the explosion was still 2 weeks away. I maintained the veneer with surgical precision, moving through the house as the dutiful, high-earning consultant wife, all while my inner world had gone silent and cold. The first piece of physical evidence arrived 3 days after I activated Operation Zero Tolerance. It wasn't a smoking gun, just a whisper in the dark, an unfamiliar expensive charge for the top-floor bar of the Metropolitan, a luxury downtown hotel, appeared on the credit card Julian and I shared for household expenses. When I casually mentioned it that evening, Julian didn't flinch. He was too practiced. "Oh, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand, focusing intensely on stirring his overpriced tea. "I hit it off with a potential gallery investor. Very discreet, very exclusive. We just had a few drinks to cement the relationship." I pretended to accept the excuse, nodding and making a show of prioritizing his artistic endeavors. I told him he should spend whatever it took for his career breakthrough. I watched the relief flood his eyes, relief that he was still believed, still funded. But I wasn't fooled. The explanation didn't sit right, a jagged edge in an otherwise smooth performance. The emotional verification came that weekend. Scarlett was preparing for her next Sunday brunch, which meant endless tedious posts about the upcoming menu and the guest list. I was scrolling through her feed, a habit I detested but maintained for surveillance, when I saw it. A photo posted from the exact velvet-draped bar at the Metropolitan. Scarlett was smiling a practiced, coy smile before a beautiful signature cocktail with a caption, "Such a lovely surprise. Thank you, as always." It was a generic post designed to hint at a secret admirer, but on the sleek, dark surface of the glass table in the foreground, I could see the unmistakable reflection of a familiar monogrammed men's watch, its expensive gold casing catching the low light. It was Julian's. There was no doubt. It was the watch I had bought him for our 5th anniversary, the watch he wore every day. The watch was placed deliberately, a silent boast in the frame. In that instant, all the pieces clicked perfectly into place, forming a picture of staggering betrayal and shared arrogance. The truth, stark and unavoidable, was now mine. My reaction wasn't a passionate, tearful rage. There was no screaming, no breaking of things. Instead, an overwhelming, profound sense of cold, absolute certainty settled over me. It was a clarity I hadn't felt in years, a psychological release from the agonizing doubt and manipulation I hadn't realized I'd been enduring. The confirmation of the betrayal felt like the ultimate freedom. I was no longer bound by the hope that they might change or that I was simply overreacting. I was alone, but I was finally right. I was no longer a victim. I was merely a witness preparing to be the judge. I walked straight to my study and locked the door. I pulled out my secure phone, the one no one knew existed, and called Leo Mendez. I gave him the code phrase we established years ago, a phrase that meant everything is compromised, proceed immediately, and without question. The clock is running backward. Leo's voice, usually easy and cheerful, turned sharp and professional. He understood this was not a drill. This was my final declaration of war. My instruction was precise, clinical, and devoid of emotion. I need everything. Clean, undeniable, and comprehensive. Follow Julian and Scarlett. No limits. Video, audio, financials. I want proof of malice and financial fraud. I need to be able to destroy their manufactured reality and their reputation beyond repair. Do not stop until I call it off. Leo, knowing my capacity for planning and the depth of my reserve, simply replied, "Consider it done. I'll use the resources we discussed." I spent the next hour alone defining the stakes and the ultimate goal. I didn't want alimony or a messy, expensive public fight that would waste more of my life. My goal was systematic destruction of their identities. They had built their entire lives, Julian's artistic integrity, Scarlett's social status, my parents' respected suburban facade on my money and my lie. I was going to remove the foundation and let the entire shallow structure collapse on them. I was seeking not just divorce, but absolute financial and social exile. The MBA graduation was the perfect stage, the moment I was supposed to be at my most vulnerable and proud, ready to thank them for their support. Instead, I would use that spotlight to illuminate their darkness. As the sun set, my secure phone buzzed once. It was an encrypted file from Leo. The subject line was simply verification. I downloaded it. It was a single high-resolution surveillance photo taken hours ago. It showed Julian and Scarlett entering the same high-end building in an unmarked black sedan. They were laughing, their body language intimate, their heads close. It was undeniable. They were not two people who had just been cementing a relationship with a gallery owner. They were conspirators and lovers. The sight of the photo brought a sharp momentary pang, not of heartache, but of profound psychological trauma, the feeling of realizing you have grieved for a ghost. Then the feeling passed. My sense of calm returned, deeper and more resolute. I had loved a ghost. Now I was focused on the two predatory people who had replaced him. I deleted the photo from the shared cloud drive, ensuring no digital trace of my having seen it remained. I sent Leo a reply, the single word that sealed their fate: continue. The transition was complete. I was no longer a wife, a sister, or a daughter. I was the architect of consequence. The next week became a blur of high-stakes precision, a period of meticulous evidence gathering that consumed my every waking hour. I felt less like a betrayed wife and more like an intelligence operative dismantling a hostile network. The psychological distance between me and the family was now vast and growing. I was preparing to destroy them, but I needed an unbreakable legal fortress built from paper. The first essential piece was the financial audit delivered by Leo in a secure encrypted file titled "The Ledger of Lies." The numbers were staggering, but the details were the real emotional blow. It wasn't just Julian's expensive art supplies or Scarlett's catering bill. Leo had mapped every transaction, revealing how Julian was regularly transferring significant funds to Scarlett under the guise of shared project costs, money that immediately vanished into her social accounts. Worse, the audit revealed the parents' deep complicity. Vivian and Stephen were not merely naive. They were actively involved, signing off on expense reports that categorized hundreds of dollars of imported truffles, vintage champagne, and other lavish ingredients for Scarlett's brunch as mundane household utilities and routine maintenance. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were using my income as a collective slush fund to maintain their shared delusion of upper-class living. The realization that my parents weren't just fooled by Julian and Scarlett, but were partners in the systematic financial deceit, turned the cold knot in my stomach to solid ice. Just when I thought the betrayal couldn't deepen, Leo provided the file labeled "The Second Seduction." Surveillance footage and receipts confirmed that Julian was maintaining a relationship with a third woman completely different from Scarlett. Her name was Tamsin, a younger, aspiring influencer with a modest following. Julian used the money he fraudulently obtained from my shared accounts to buy Tamsin ridiculously expensive designer gifts and take her to upscale restaurants. The footage was clear. Julian didn't look at her with love or even lust. He looked at her with a sick, satisfied sense of ownership. This was not a moment of passion. It was a transactional relationship fulfilling his twisted, pathetic desire for domination and validation over a younger woman who was impressed by the money I had earned. It confirmed Julian's core truth. He saw all women, including me, his wife, as mere sources of money and ego boosts. Scarlett had foolishly believed their affair was special and unique. Julian had simply been adding another conquest funded by my account. With the financial and personal evidence locked down, I moved to solidify the legal ground. I consulted Ms. Eleanor Vance, no relation to Julian, a brutal, high-powered attorney known for dismantling empires with surgical precision. I presented her with Leo's comprehensive reports, the photographic proof, and the clear financial audit trail of fraud. Eleanor, a woman who rarely showed surprise, was initially shocked by the sheer scale of my actual wealth and my clinical detachment. She reviewed the evidence and confirmed that with the documentation I possessed, she could not only ensure the divorce would be swift and clean, but could also guarantee the successful clawback of all misappropriated funds, citing fraud and marital malfeasance. She was initially prepared for a divorce fight. She was instead facing a financial execution. I told her I wanted the divorce finalized and the financial claims drafted ready to be served the moment the plane touched down on the mainland after my graduation. My instructions were simple. I want the truth to be the only leverage. While the legal paperwork was being finalized, I took the most proactive step toward my new life, using a completely separate secure entity known only to me and Leo. I quietly finalized the purchase of a secluded multi-million-dollar beachfront estate on the island of Kauai. The transaction was executed with absolute secrecy, the title deed notarized and secured. This was not a spontaneous decision or a mere vacation home. This was my sovereign territory, a physical, tangible symbol of the independence and self-made fortune that I was reclaiming. It was my fortress purchased entirely with the untraceable profits from my initial venture money that Julian and my family had no idea existed. The trap for the final performance was now set. I arranged the final details for the graduation. I made sure Julian, Scarlett, Vivian, and Stephen all received personalized invitations, emphasizing the crucial turning point the valedictorian speech represented for my career and future. This was their call to the stage. Concurrently, I arranged for Leo to set up professional, covert video coverage of the entire auditorium entrance, the seating area, and specifically the front row where my family would sit. I needed an unimpeachable multi-angle record of their betrayal for the public stage. This footage, Leo confirmed, would be impossible to deny or spin. I sat in my study late that night, reviewing the deed to the Kauai property, the beautiful paper confirming my ownership. I closed the folder on the thick document, the feeling of profound peace and agency flooding me. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered, the future home was secured, and the legal hammer was ready to drop. I pulled up the schedule for my final week, whispered, "Just 2 weeks left," to the silence of the room, and began crafting the first social media post, the one that would launch the public war after their walkout. The last few days leading up to graduation were an exercise in psychological endurance. I had to maintain the charade of the devoted, successful wife and daughter while meticulously plotting their downfall. This was the final blueprint phase where the emotional separation became absolute, and the physical preparations for my escape were finalized. The family insisted on a staged, excruciatingly fake, last family dinner the Wednesday before the ceremony. It was meant to be a celebration of my achievement, but it was really a performance for them, confirming their status as the supportive family of the valedictorian. My father, Stephen, was particularly bombastic. giving a loud, self-congratulatory toast about his instinct for recognizing talent and my dutiful repayment of his investment. He spoke as if he had earned the MBA. Julian chimed in with a pretentious comment about how my financial success would finally allow him the undisturbed space to create, conveniently forgetting that he'd had that space for years. Scarlett didn't even pretend to hide her impatience, repeatedly checking her phone and yawning, already focused on the logistics of her next brunch. I sat there observing them like specimens under a microscope, absorbing every final, painful, self-serving word. There was no love left, only a profound, cold pity for their self-deception. This dinner served its purpose. It solidified my resolve, proving once and for all that they valued the image of my success more than me. Immediately after the dinner, I initiated the physical separation. I went to my closet and packed a single suitcase. I chose only clothing I had purchased with my own original premarital money items that held no sentimental or financial link to them. I left behind my wedding ring and all the expensive jewelry and gifts Julian had ever given me. I knew they were all purchased with my credit cards anyway, and they would be part of the assets I'd claw back. Their presence was repulsive. I laid out the new outfit I would wear upon arrival in Kauai, a simple, unpretentious silk dress that had been waiting unworn for this moment. It was the visual antithesis of the gaudy, status-obsessed fashion Scarlett embraced. It signified the genuine, self-made Donna Moore I was about to claim. The rest of my time was devoted to the digital arsenal. I met Leo one final time in a secure, neutral location. We reviewed the 3 core folders of evidence, ensuring their encryption keys and timed release mechanisms were flawless. 1. Folder 1, the walkout video. The multi-angle footage of my family's departure from the auditorium designed to cause maximum public outrage and shame. 2. Folder 2, the affairs photos. Texts. The undeniable proof of Julian's duplicity with both Scarlett and Tamsin, establishing his pattern of emotional and financial fraud. 3. Folder 3, the audit financial statements. The clean, irrefutable legal evidence of their systematic misappropriation of funds categorized for the attorney. We coordinated the timing of the 2 devastating social media posts. The first would be launched immediately after my plane landed in Kauai, revealing my escape and new life. The second 2 hours later would launch the evidence. This was the point of no return. Once those digital bombs were dropped, there was no possibility of retreat, reconciliation, or denial. I also spent a crucial late night revising my valedictorian speech. The original draft was a standard polite address, but now it felt suffocatingly dishonest. I went through it line by line, removing any trace of gratitude or sentimental acknowledgement toward my family. I replaced those passages with a powerful, slightly coded dedication to resilience, self-reliance, and the courage to walk away from what is false. I spoke of the strength found in solitude and the triumph of personal integrity over inherited expectation. The words were technically appropriate for a graduation, but to anyone who knew the real context, they would sound like a declaration of independence. Before I finally collapsed into bed, I allowed myself one final moment of observation. I walked into the master bedroom. Julian was already asleep, his breathing heavy and even oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed world built on my silent compliance was only hours from total collapse. He looked pathetic in the quiet dark, not powerful, not desirable, just a grown man who had chosen to be a parasite. I felt a brief, sharp, final pang of sorrow for the person I thought he was on our wedding day, a small mourning for a future that had never existed. I realized I had spent too long grieving a ghost, and the only path forward was to bury the illusion completely. I dismissed the sentiment. The next morning, I dressed meticulously in my cap and gown. I looked in the full-length mirror, examining the woman I saw. I was not a student, not a wife, and not a daughter. I was an unshakable force, calm and completely prepared. I pulled the pins from the speech I would deliver, folding the paper precisely. I whispered to my reflection a solemn vow to myself. Today I graduate from you all. The script was written. The stage was set. It was time to walk toward the spotlight and the subsequent definitive walkout. The auditorium was vast, hushed, and felt profoundly unreal. The gown was hot and heavy, but the weight was nothing compared to the script I was about to execute. I stood on the brightly lit stage looking out over hundreds of faces, but my eyes were locked on the front row. There they were, Julian looking falsely proud, Scarlett already fidgeting, Vivian and Stephen the perfect picture of the respected, supportive parents. This was their stage too, and I was about to snatch the spotlight from them. I began my valedictorian speech, my voice clear and measured. My words were precise, professional, and entirely devoid of the warmth they expected. I spoke of strategic exits and the necessity of shedding dead weight for true growth. I watched them. They were smiling, oblivious to the coded language, absorbing only the applause meant for their successful daughter. I was exactly 5 minutes into the address, hitting a key thematic point about the sacrificing of temporary comfort for genuine, lasting self-reliance. When I saw the signal, Scarlett leaned into Julian, whispering a dismissive, utterly bored line about the time and the urgency of getting to her brunch before the chef's reservation expired. It was a premeditated sound cue. Then, in one coordinated, breathtakingly arrogant movement, the four of them rose. Julian placed a hand on Stephen's shoulder. Vivian touched Scarlett's arm. They gathered their coats and, with an air of aristocratic impatience, began their walkout. The collective gasp in the auditorium was a visceral thing, a sharp, shocked intake of air that settled into an immediate, profound silence. The coordinated departure was exactly as cruel and public as I had scripted. They didn't even glance back at me, the person standing in the spotlight of her life's achievement. They simply walked away through the swinging mahogany doors, prioritizing mimosas and gossip over my triumph. The shock was a physical wave threatening to destabilize the moment. But I didn't falter. I looked at the empty seats, and in that absence, I felt an explosive surge of clarity and strength. The initial plan to remain composed was instantly elevated. I took a deep breath and let their absence fuel me. My voice, moments before professional, now grew powerful and resonant, fueled by the conviction that every subsequent word I uttered was only for myself. True success, I continued cutting through the murmurs, is often measured not by who stays in your life, but by the courage to walk away from what is false. The crowd, confused but captivated, settled back into silence. My speech became a raw, passionate dedication to resilience, integrity, and the strength of the lone individual to define her own reality. I spoke not as a graduate, but as a survivor. When I finished, the applause was deafening, a thunderous, warm noise that felt like a powerful wave of validation and support washing over the stage. It was the sound of my self-liberation, and it was glorious. I accepted my diploma, smiling and shaking hands, but my focus remained laser-sharp on the next step. I slipped away from the well-wishers and the celebratory noise. My closest friends thought I was heading to a quiet reception. Instead, I went directly to the private room I had reserved, shed the gown, and changed into the simple, travel-ready clothes I had set aside. With my single suitcase in hand, containing only my laptop, my legal documents, and my simple attire, I walked out the back door and into the waiting black car. The flight had begun. The drive to the airport was silent, broken only by the low hum of the engine. The boarding process was efficient and anonymous. As the plane taxied and finally lifted off, flying away from the cold gray mainland, I watched the familiar landscape shrink beneath me. It was a cinematic moment, the physical severing of ties. I wasn't leaving home. I was abandoning a prison. Every mile the jet gained, every cloud we passed, pulled me further into the brilliant, vibrant future I had quietly constructed for myself. The plane journey was the emotional transition. I slept little, instead, staring out the window, watching the stars, and waiting for the morning light. When we finally began our descent, the world transformed. The cold light of the mainland was replaced by the brilliant golden sun of the Pacific. Stepping off the plane, the air was warm, thick with the intoxicating scent of plumeria and salt. I was home. I was met by a driver who took me away from the tourist crowds and deep into an exclusive, secluded neighborhood on Kauai. The car pulled up to a house I had only ever seen in architectural blueprints. When the driver opened the door, I felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. The home was a modern, elegant, sprawling villa built around its spectacular geography. This was my homecoming. I walked through the door and straight onto the terrace. The sight was breathtaking. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched an infinity pool that dissolved into the turquoise expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The elegance was unpretentious, the quietness profound. I had never owned anything so completely mine. I was free. I sank into a sprawling white daybed by the pool, letting the tropical sun warm the deep-seated chill the mainland had given me. This was the first moment of true unadulterated peace I had felt in years. I picked up my secure phone. The time was precisely 1:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right in the middle of Scarlett's brunch hour. It was time for the detonation. I took a photo, a beautifully composed shot, of the endless blue sea, the tropical light, the stunning infinity pool, and a bottle of perfectly chilled expensive champagne awaiting my first toast. I opened my social media profile, the one my family followed but rarely interacted with, believing it was just filled with boring work updates. Beneath the photo, I added a short, devastating caption: "Sometimes hard work is rewarded in unexpected ways. Here's to my true graduation and to the beginning of a new life." I pressed post. The quiet phone instantly came alive. The screen began to vibrate like mad flooding with an immediate cascade of notifications, missed calls, and frantic messages from Julian, Scarlett, Vivian, and Stephen. Their Sunday brunch had been violently interrupted. I could picture their faces twisted with rage, realizing I was living a life of luxury and wealth that they not only didn't authorize, but didn't even know existed. They couldn't tolerate the fact that the resource they believed they owned was now shining brighter and living a far more elegant real life than their shabby illusion. The public detonation had worked. I ignored every buzzing vibration. I looked at the sunset, the sky turning molten orange over the infinite water. Then, with a profound sense of resolve, I opened the secure folder from Leo, pulling out the video file of the graduation walkout. I wrote a brief clinical caption for the post that would follow in 2 hours. The footage speaks for itself. The party starts now. I was watching the sunset of my old life, preparing the sunrise of the reckoning. The sound of the waves was the only applause I needed. The next morning, I flew back to the mainland. I didn't need to stay in Kauai to witness the chaos. I needed to be present for the final act of the grand deconstruction. I landed, rented a neutral car, and drove directly to the house. The energy inside the home was no longer the oppressive stillness of pretense. It was the vibrating, hideous aftermath of an explosion. I walked in to find the house a disaster zone, not just physically, but emotionally. Scarlett and Julian were locked in a vicious, screaming fight. Their voices were raw, stripped bare of their usual affected calm. I stood in the doorway and simply watched. Scarlett had clearly just seen the contents of folder 2, the affairs. "You bought her a Gucci belt," she shrieked, her expensive clothes disheveled, her beautiful face contorted with hatred. "You told me your time with me was special, an illicit bond, that little influencer. That was my money, you cheap, pathetic fraud. You risked my standing for a common fling." She had foolishly believed their affair was a unique power play. The realization that she was just one of Julian's several simultaneously funded conquests was tearing her pride to shreds. Julian, his face slick with sweat and fear, stammered out excuses, calling Tamsin just a temporary creative muse, and pathetically insisting Scarlett was the one he truly cared about. but his words only poured oil on the fire of her shattered ego. "Shut up! You only ever loved Donna's credit card." Scarlett spat the truth of his financial parasitic nature finally escaping her lips. Vivian and Stephen stood frozen by the grand fireplace, utterly paralyzed. They weren't trying to stop the fight. They were simply watching helplessly as their fragile, expensive life crumbled. They were surrounded by the wreckage of their own choices, and their only concern was who might be listening outside. I broke the silence. My, it seems I missed the most dramatic part of the party. The four of them froze. All at once, they turned their hateful, blame-filled eyes toward me. I was the one they deemed the cause of everything. The confrontation had begun. "Donna, how dare you come back here?" My father, Stephen, roared, his face crimson. "You've ruined us! You've destroyed the family's reputation with those malicious lies online." I stepped slowly into the room, calm and utterly untouched by his volume. "Ruined you?" I echoed, my tone dangerously quiet. "Tell me, father, who was it that walked out of his only daughter's valedictorian speech to prioritize a champagne brunch? Who spent years using my achievements as a shield while plotting to reallocate my retirement funds?" As a father, have you ever once acknowledged my effort, my self-made achievements for what they truly are or was? I simply a convenient funding source. Stephen's face became a blotchy crimson. Words failed him, his typical bluster dissolving under the cold light of truth. Next came my mother, Vivian, trying to resort to tears and emotional manipulation. "Please, Donna, stop this. Delete those posts. I can't even show my face in the neighborhood anymore. The gossips." Her concern was purely superficial. "Do you have any idea how many years I've spent killing parts of myself just to avoid the judgment of others, yours included?" I replied, my voice hard as ice. "You must have noticed long ago how warped this family had become. You saw Julian's entitlement, Scarlett's greed, and your husband's cowardice. And yet you chose silence. You chose peace over truth. Is that what you call a mother's love?" She collapsed onto the sofa, murmuring weakly, I didn't mean for it to be like this." She was mourning her reputation, not her relationship with me. Scarlett, hysterical, and backed into a corner, then pointed an accusatory finger at me. "This is all your fault. You didn't pay enough attention to Julian. You're a failure as a wife." A failure as a wife. I smiled slowly, pitilessly, looking at her, as if she were a small, tragic mistake. "Yes, perhaps you're right. I must be a failure as a wife. After all, I never could have imagined that my husband would be having a long-term affair with my own sister and another woman, Tamsin, all simultaneously. How foolish of me." I let the silence hang heavy, watching Scarlett process the fresh layer of humiliation. Too bad, Scarlett. To him, you were nothing more than one of many playthings for his ego. You thought you were special, didn't you? But in truth, you're just a parasite who can't find her own worth without leeching off others' success. The color drained entirely from Scarlett's face. The accusation was brutal, final, and perfectly true, completely exposed and without allies. Julian crawled toward my feet, his voice reduced to a pathetic, sweaty whine. "Donna, I'm sorry. I'm really, truly sorry. Let's start over. You need me, don't you? I can't live without you. I know. Let's go back to Hawaii together. You must have been lonely there by yourself, right?" He still saw me as a resource to be managed, believing my show of independence was just an emotional stunt designed to win him back. The sheer idiotic entitlement of his words was the final trigger. "Actually, Julian," I said, reaching into my handbag. I didn't hesitate. I pulled 2 thick documents from a manila envelope and slid them across the granite countertop toward him. The first was the title deed to the Kauai villa. It was notarized, legally binding, and the owner section clearly read Donna Moore. "That wasn't a vacation, Julian. It was a homecoming to my real life. The one I bought 2 years ago." Julian, Scarlett, and my parents stared at the document in stunned, silent disbelief. "That's impossible," my father muttered, his voice trembling. There's no way you could afford that on a consultant's salary, not in cash. Of course not, I replied perfectly calm. Not with the salary you think I earn. I delivered the final financial revelation I had kept hidden all these years, the truth that rendered them completely powerless. Back in college, I started an IT startup with Leo. You all thought it was a hobby project. Didn't you? It wasn't. It grew so big, it became a social phenomenon. A few years ago, I sold the rights to a global corporation for a payout that's worth dozens of times more than what any of you could earn in your entire lives. The revelation struck them like lightning, not just the wealth, but the fact that I had built it entirely on my own in secret while they dismissed me. I then placed the second document in front of Julian, the divorce agreement prepared by Eleanor Vance. Our marriage ends today. I won't demand alimony. Instead, you'll repay every cent you spent using my cards in full, backed by the audit in folder 3. If you have any objections, we'll settle it in court. The evidence is public. Julian could only stammer, before collapsing onto the floor where he stood. He was destroyed. I looked around at the four of them, hollow, broken, their pretenses shattered. I delivered my final statement of closure. You deserve each other. My voice was cold, echoing with finality. The four of you can stay in this little box, licking each other's wounds, throwing blame around, and living out your miserable lives together. You have the company you deserve. I walked toward the front door, pulling the heavy mahogany behind me. Just before the latch clicked, I left them with my ultimate closing line. The price you paid for ruining my graduation turned out to be quite high, didn't it? But this isn't punishment. It's simply the inevitable consequence of your own choices. I opened the front door and walked out into the sunlight. I never looked back. The destruction was complete. The moment the door closed behind me, my phone, which I had placed on silent, began to vibrate with a desperate ferocity I had never witnessed. The immediate aftermath was a digital flood of communication, all of it ringing hollow. There were messages from Julian, long, rambling texts pleading for reconciliation, claiming my performance was brilliant but unnecessary, and insisting that he could change. There were messages from Vivian, moving instantly from tearful accusation to panicked, desperate apologies, promising she would never interfere again. Stephen sent short, angry missives demanding I consider the family legacy and delete the evidence before they were completely ruined. I read perhaps a dozen of them, enough to confirm that not a single word contained a lick of genuine remorse. Their concern wasn't for the years of emotional or financial abuse. It was the shallow, transparent desire to regain their comfortable lives and their convenient source of money. They saw me only as a lost resource. I deleted every message unread after that, and without hesitation, executed the final step of my plan. I blocked all their contacts' phone numbers, emails, and all social media accounts. Silence. Complete, absolute, liberating silence. Over the next 6 months, my business partner, Leo Mendez, who remained on the mainland and continued to manage the financial cleanup and legal actions, became my sole reluctant connection to their rapidly deteriorating reality. He kept me updated, and the details confirmed the narrative I had authored. Julian's exile was swift and brutal. Because of the public viral nature of my social media revelation, backed by undeniable bank records and surveillance footage, he was instantly unemployable. His reputation as the enigmatic artist vanished, replaced by the reality of the unemployed man who lived off his wife's wealth and cheated with her sister. That miserable reality was all that remained. Leo confirmed he had lost all the shared assets and had been forced to move into a small, dim, isolated apartment on the outskirts of town. A man with pride as fragile as Julian's could never hold a proper job. He now survived on day-to-day manual labor. His hands, which were once only used to hold expensive paintbrushes, were now covered in cuts and calluses, a fitting physical consequence for his deceit. Scarlett's isolation was equally comprehensive. Her weekly Sunday brunches immediately and inevitably came to an end. The so-called friends who had flocked to her drawn only by the fake wealth and status my money provided, vanished instantly, scattering like insects when the light is turned on. Social media, which had been her kingdom, turned into a hostile prison, flooded with insults calling her a fraud and a parasite. She eventually deleted her accounts and disappeared completely from her social circles, and society no longer an influencer, just a person with no identity. Vivian and Stephen's prison was the most psychologically devastating for them. They had always valued appearances above all else, and now the neighborhood they loved was their personal hell. Gossip was rampant. They were subjected to mixed stares of pity and contempt that followed them everywhere they went. They sold the big house to cover their legal and financial liabilities. They were forced to move away, living quietly, suffocating under the knowledge that their family's spectacular implosion was the only thing anyone would ever remember about their respected lives. Their fear of public judgment had become their living nightmare. I learned these updates with a cold detachment, feeling no triumphant joy, only the quiet truth of consequence. The stage was cleared, and the supporting cast had been escorted to their designated fates. 6 months have passed since I closed that mahogany door. I live now in a state of profound restorative peace on the island of Kauai. This is my new life, and the difference is not just financial, it's atmospheric. The air here is clean and honest, devoid of the emotional static that had choked me for years on the mainland. I wake up to the sound of the ocean, not the anxious chatter of my mother or the pretentious sighs of my ex-husband. My company, which Leo now manages as CEO, continues to thrive. The work is meaningful and focused, surrounded by partners I can truly trust because they respect my intellect, not my wallet. The quiet luxury of the villa allows me a focus I never had before. On weekends, I sometimes host small gatherings by the infinity pool. These are not status parties or networking events. They are simple, joyful moments with close friends and business associates who understand the value of genuine warmth and connection. We talk about ideas, laughter comes easily, and no one is scrutinizing the brand of champagne or the cost of the hors d'oeuvres. This new community is built on mutual respect, standing in sharp, satisfying contrast to Scarlett's expensive hollow brunches that were built entirely on deceit. I often sit by the shore watching the vast, turbulent Pacific, and I allow myself final reflection on the journey. I realized that my true worth was never in the money I earned, but in the agency I ultimately seized. The MBA was a distraction. The real education was learning to trust my own judgment, to act on the truth, and to cut out the rot. The emotional wounds have healed, replaced by an unshakable confidence. I am no longer defined by the expectations or the needs of the people I left behind. My graduation was not from school, but from the toxic codependency that was slowly consuming my soul. I was paying for a life that was suffocating me, grieving a marriage and a family that had been dead for years. That profound sorrow is gone, replaced by the boundless freedom of this horizon. The betrayal was the crucible, and my self-made fortune was the tool that forged my escape. I look out over the Pacific, the embodiment of vastness and pure potential, and I feel utterly and completely sovereign. The fear is gone. The anger is settled. Only clarity remains. They thought I was their investment. I realized I was my own exit strategy. The price of my freedom was high, but the cost of staying was my entire self. I finally chose the life I had earned. Donna Moore finally found her shore of clarity. She made her choice, paid the price for her freedom, and rebuilt her life on a foundation of genuine self-worth. If you were nodding along to Donna's story of betrayal and radical triumph, hit the subscribe button. Let us know what you would have done in her situation in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.